Shalom, shalom. I'm La Yhuh. Ani Shalama, Tuda Rabbah, La Shema. That is shalom, people of Yhuh. I am Shalama. Thanks much for listening. If you're new, want to say welcome. And if you're returning, want to say welcome back. And for those who have subscribed, I want to say thank you so much for your patience. I know it's been a while since I've been able to release some new video presentations and information, but for good reason. Life be lifing, as they say. But as you take a look at this particular topic here, and that we're looking at is it's a massive one of great magnitude. So really wasn't one that I wanted to hastily just lay out there. I took a great deal of study and prayer and fasting in some instances, and certainly consulting with some trustworthy Akeem that I have, some brothers, and we sharpen one another. And now I feel very comfortable with releasing this information here. So, we don't like to do long introductions. Let's hop right to it. Another look at Paul is what I've entitled this series. It's going to be a lengthy one. It's probably going to be a controversial one. I don't do controversial content intentionally anyway, but just by nature, because of the topic, it's going to be a controversial one. So I'll say this offhand. Please keep an open mind. Don't draw any conclusions. I encourage you not to do that before you've had an opportunity to hear all the information. Go test it out, pray over it, research it for yourself, and then you'll draw a conclusion there. I don't want to create a space that's welcoming of debate, but more so an inquisitive space, answering certain questions that may be overlooked because there are some presuppositions, some filters that are set up. Therefore, you can't see certain things, and therefore we don't ask certain questions, right? I want it to be that type of space, looking at those questions, or maybe there's a fear to ask certain questions because it challenges our beliefs, and maybe we have to change something that we believe, right? And so that's more so of what I'm trying to create here. So with that being said, let's get right into it. What you have before you is kind of a timeline, a table of contents that I'm going to pretty much stick to in this order. I'm going to go a little bit out of order just for this first one, but I'll read through these and we'll get to it. The first thing we want to do is remove presuppositions that I alluded to earlier. We're going to answer the question, why question Paul? We're going to look at, does Cephas or Peter endorse Paul? Look at Paul's conversion testimony. Look at Paul's apostleship, his credentials. Look at Paul's source of revelation. We're going to look at Paul's good news, or Paul's gospel, as he calls it, my gospel. Look at Paul's interpretation of scripture, and look at Paul's commands/teachings. Does he introduce any new commands or teachings? And look at Paul's eschatology as well. I may add another topic in there as we go along, now that I think about it, but let's get to it. Removing presuppositions. That's the first thing we got to do, is remove presuppositions. The first presupposition that we had to remove is Paul is an apostle. That's the first presupposition that we have to remove. Excuse me for a misspelling. I'm trying to type this with a pen. But Paul is an apostle, right? Why do we remove that presupposition? Well, we remove that because when we set him up as an apostle, then we basically say that he's without error, right? There's no possibility of him being wrong. That's normally the sense you get. Every word he says is absolutely correct. So we have to remove that presupposition because we're approaching this more so at an investigative, angle, and not so much more substantiating him as an apostle. So we have to remove that presupposition. And then secondly, the presupposition we have to remove is that Paul's letters are scripture. Paul's letters are scripture. This is an important one to remove as well, because when you say Paul's letters are scripture, and I can testify to this, you probably can testify yourself. You come across something Paul wrote or something that Paul said, and, you kind of scratch your head, did he really mean that? And he said it very clearly. He said it very plainly. But because Paul is scripture as a presupposition, what he said very clearly or very plainly, when it contradicts the rest of scripture, then we're like, that's not really what he said. That's not really what he meant. And so we normally have one or two responses, right? The first response is, I'm not knowledgeable enough to understand what he's saying. I got to go deeper, right? And as a result of that, you say, Paul, he was definitely an intellectual. He was certainly knowledgeable. He studied under Gamaliel, which was the grandson of Hillel, which was the most renowned teacher of the Torah in Yashara'al. And so he was no slouch when it comes to understanding the Torah. He was very knowledgeable. And so you say, man, I'm not at Paul's level, or this is not the time for the Most High to reveal this to me. So we just give him a pass on something he said, and we come back to it later, right? Or either the second response could be, you know what? let me go to a scholar, someone who studied this more than I have, and go to a commentary. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but sometimes we can lean on that. And we go to these commentaries, and I know I can speak for myself, where they go to great lengths trying to explain away something Paul said very clearly and very simply, and, pages and, paragraphs and paragraphs just to explain one phrase sometimes where he said what he said. And so those are normally kind of the two responses, and, jumping through great hoops and leaps and bounds just to explain away something Paul said. It shouldn't be that way. And so we have to remove those two presuppositions. Paul is an apostle, and Paul's letters are scripture. And when we do that, we go to Paul with an open mind, removing any filters, and we're, again, investigating him like the first century Yhudim, right? That's what we're doing. And therefore, we can draw accurate conclusions. And even if you draw the same conclusion, so be it. But we want to do the best we can to remove those presuppositions. And before we go any further, let me stop and say that because my position on Paul has changed, I have to go back through my videos on the channel and see if I still agree with how I interpreted his letters. And if not, then those videos will be coming down. And I publicly want to apologize and ask for forgiveness if my incorrect interpretation of Paul's letters have led anyone astray. I may have been like those commentaries where I went to great lengths to try to explain something the way that Paul said. And so I just want to make sure I put that out there before we go any further. Secondly, let's go, why question Paul? Why do we even question Paul? Again, I encourage you, don't draw any conclusions before you've heard all the information. And when you even think about questioning Paul, circles of faith and communities all around Christianity and Catholicism, whatever, kind of hand in hand, in my opinion, but they, kind of cringe at the idea of questioning Paul and shun the idea of questioning Paul because so much of their doctrine is lenient on Paul's teaching and interpretation of his letters. And so when you think about questioning Paul, here goes Yashara'al and those who follow through all, they're always questioning Paul, right? As if this is some trend, some fad, as if this hasn't existed from day one since Paul hit the scene. Paul has been validated for so long. Sure, he has been validated for so long, but I would submit to you that just as long as he's been validated, he's been questioned. From day one, he's been questioned. As soon as he went to Yhudim, they questioned him. And they try to kill him, matter of fact. And those questions have never been put to a final rest. And after all this information is laid out, I believe you understand why it's never been put to a final rest. And so why question Paul? But I want to get to a scriptural reason for questioning Paul. And I want to do that by looking at Dabarim. Let's look at chapter 18. I was going to do 13, but let's look at chapter 18. And let's start here in verse number 18. And here in verse number 18, it reads, I shall raise up for them a Nabiah like you out of the midst of their brothers, and I shall put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. And it shall be, the man who does not listen to my words, which he speaks in my name, I require it of him. But the Nabiah who presumes to speak a word in my name, which I have not commanded him to speak, or who speaks in the name of other mighty ones, even that Nabiah shall die. And when you say in your heart, how do we know the word which Yhuh has not spoken? When the Nabiah speaks in the name of Yhuh and the word is not, or comes not, that is the word which Yhuh has not spoken. The Nabiah has spoken it presumptuously. Do not be afraid of him. So when you look at this passage of scripture, really just emphasizing verse number 21, it's going to answer the question, why question Paul? Notice the Most High says, and when you say in your heart. So here comes a prophet and Nabiah. He stands up, a mouthpiece, a messenger, and says, I have a word of the Most High, right? Well, the Most High anticipates or even expects for his people. Notice it says, and when you say in your heart, not if you say in your heart, but when you say in your heart, as to say that anytime anybody stands up and say, I have a word for the Most High, then Most High expects us to have this question in our heart. How do we know that this is the word of Yhuh? So if I were to answer the question, why question Paul? It's a simple one, because the Most High said we could and we should. Matter of fact, I would go far as to say that he gives us permission to. Anybody and everybody, man, woman, boy, and girl, doesn't matter who you are. When you stand up and say, I have a word from Yhuh, then you automatically qualify to be put under the magnifying glass of scrutiny. Doesn't matter who you are. Paul was a man. He qualifies. Even Yahushua himself, when he was on the scene saying, I have a word from Yhuh, from my Father. Well, guess what? They scrutinized him, maybe with the wrong intention in their heart, but they certainly scrutinized him because he qualified, because he was a prophet, because he was a messenger of the Most High, and therefore he qualified to be put to scrutiny. And so, again, answering this question simply. Anybody says, oh, why are you questioning Paul? Why are you questioning Paul? We'll take him here to Deuteronomy 18, and say, because the Most High said we could and we should. That's why we're questioning Paul. So with that being said, I want to look at something here. I'm going to start with kind of out of order, but for me, it was a nail in the coffin, as they say, a smoking gun, even, as they say, when it came to changing my stance on Paul. And it's, what did Paul teach? Did Paul teach it was okay to eat foods offered to idols? Right. And I'm starting with this one because I want us to be really interested in this topic and not just kind of, wave it off as, oh, here we go again, these anti-Paul people. But I'm starting with this here. And again, this is kind of a smoking gun for me. Let's get right to it. I'm going to start with looking at the Most High's view on idols and foods offered to idols. It's always good that we start with what the Father said about idols, right? And let's start in Leviticus 19:4. He says, do not turn to idols or vanity. That word in the Yhuh is the word vanity, but it's translated to idols. He said, and do not make for yourselves molded mighty ones. I am Yhuh, your Elohim. In Deuteronomy chapter 27, verse 15, he says, cursed is the man who makes a carved or molded image, an abomination to Yhuh, the works of the hands of the craftsman, and puts it up in secret. And all the people shall answer and say, Amen. Then we have, and shall move Exodus, chapter 34, verse 15. He says, lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and they whore after their mighty ones, and slaughter to their mighty ones, and one of them invites you, and you eat of his slaughterings. Let's go to Book of Wisdom, chapter 14, verse 8. And it says, but an idol made with hands is cursed, as well as he who made it. He because he made it, and it because being corruptible, it was called a mighty one. For the wicked and his wickedness alike are both hateful to Elohim. For that which is made shall be punished together with he who made it. Therefore there shall even be a reckoning upon the idols of the Gentiles. For in the creation of Elohim they have become an abomination and stumbling blocks to the beings of men, and a snare to the feet of the unwise. For the devising of idols was the beginning of spiritual whoring, and the creation of them the corruption of life. And then I'm going to read this one here in Numbers 25. I'm going to expound on it just a little bit, but it says, and Yashara'al dwelt in Shittim, and the people began to whore with the daughters of Moab. And they invited the people to the slaughterings of their mighty ones, and the people ate and bowed down to their mighty ones. Thus Yashara'al was joined to Baal Peor, and the displeasure of Yhuh burned against Yashara'al. What I want us to take away from this particular passage is when you look at eating offerings or foods offered to idols, it's more than just eating. When you think about eating with someone, sharing a meal with someone, you generally just don't invite random strangers that you meet on the street, hey, let's go eat. Eating with someone has the idea of this. It's an intimate setting. You're either trying to get to know someone or you already know someone. And so you're sharing in this meal, and it's normally an intimate thing. Well, when you look at this particular passage here, if you recall the story of Balak and Balaam or Balak, you recall that he was, trying to persuade Balak to curse the people, which didn't happen. And so what he did was put a stumbling block before the people of Yashara'al, kind of, tricked them, and so that they were intermingled with the daughters of Moab. And so that's what happened here. And as a result of that, it says in verse number 3, it says, thus Yashara'al was joined. Right? When you look at this entire passage, what you're really looking at is a ritualistic ceremony. The slaughterings, the bowing down, and the eating of those slaughterings are kind of like, if you could imagine, like a wedding ceremony, right? And what takes place at a wedding ceremony, you have the ceremony, and then you have the eating and all those things. And then after that, the husband and wife, they're recognized and all that. Well, that's kind of what's taking place here. And that's why it says in verse number 3, they joined themselves to Baal, right? That is, eating foods offered to idols is part of that ritualistic ceremony where the spiritual entity or the spiritual realm and the physical realm are sharing in something together. And when you think about Yashara'al and the Levitical priesthood and the sacrifices there, what happened? They slaughtered, they burnt some of that, right? And then they ate some of that. Well, the burning of that really represented the spiritual entity eating their portion of the meal, and then the priests would eat their portion of the meal, right? That's how the spiritual realm and the physical realm shared in a meal, and thus they're joined, right? And you think about all the feast days that we have. That's what's taking place there. It's an intimate meal and that we're sharing with the Most High. And so that's the way to view eating foods offered to any spiritual entity. It's just not eating. You're literally sharing in an intimate meal with a spiritual entity or the spiritual realm. And so that's the Most High's view when it comes to idols and eating foods offered to idols. It's a very simple one. It's an abomination. Don't do it, right? So let's look at Paul's view on the same manner. And I'm going to start in 1 Corinthians 8. I have it listed here, but I'm actually going to go and pull up Eastward. I want to read it so that I make sure we're not missing any context here. I'll read from the TS 2009. Look at verse number 1. It starts there. It says, and concerning food offered to idols. So there's no question what we're talking about. We know that we all have knowledge. Notice how many times he's going to use this word knowledge. He says, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. All right, so look at verse number 4. So then, concerning the eating of food offered to idols, we know that an idol is no matter at all in the world, and that there is no other Elohim but one. For even if there are so-called mighty ones, whether in heaven or on earth, as there are many mighty ones and many masters, for us there is one Elohim, the Father, from whom all came and from whom we live, and one Master, Yhuh, Messiah, through whom all came and through whom we live. I like the Yah Scriptures version. Then he says in verse number 7, however, not all have this knowledge. So what knowledge is he talking about? He just told us the knowledge that idols are nothing. They're not. That there is one Elohim, that's the Father, and there is one Adon, Yashara'al, right? That's the knowledge he's talking about. But he says in verse number 7, but some being aware of the idol until now eat it as having been offered to an idol, so their conscience being weak is defiled. Very simple explanation. He says there are some that don't have that before mentioned knowledge. And so what they do is instead of thinking an idol was nothing, they think an idol was something. And even though they think an idol was something, they still eat this food offered to this idol, and therefore they're basically defiling their conscience. They're offending their conscience. They're going against their conscience. That's what he simply said there. Verse number 8, but food does not commend us to Elohim, for we are none the better if we eat, nor any worse for not eating. Food has spiritual implications. I'll leave it at that. But when you think about the things that the Most High uses to test people the most, it's money and food. Let's go on. Verse number 9, but look to it, lest somehow this right of yours become a stumbling block to those who are weak. So what is Shaul or Paul saying? He says this right of yours. What right is he talking about? We don't have to guess at it. He's saying you have the right to do what? Eat foods offered to idols. But he says, beware unless you become a stumbling block to those who are weak. Who are those that are weak? The weak ones are the ones that don't have that set of knowledge about there being one Elohim and that idols are nothing. Right? So he says you have the right to eat it. And we know that's what he said because in verse number 10, he says, for if anyone sees you who have knowledge eating in idol's place. Now, I have no idea why he would use this hypothetical example here. It's like one of the worst ones, especially when he's also the one that wrote, abstain from all appearances of evil. So I have no idea why anyone who would be going into an idol's place. But I digress. But he says, if anyone who sees you who has that knowledge, right, he says, shall not his conscience, if he is weak, be built up to eat offerings to idols. So this weak brother, for whom Mashiach died, shall perish through your knowledge. Now sinning in this way against the brothers and wounding their weak conscience, you sin against Mashiach. Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I am never again going to eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble. This is, to me, is very, very easy to understand. A lot of times we do a lot of interpretation when we just should do some understanding. Paul said what he said, and he said it very clearly. And just to summarize, he basically said, listen, you have the right to eat food offered to idols. But notice he said that right is based on knowledge. I have a certain set of knowledge, and because of my knowledge, I have the right to eat foods offered to idols. However, just because I know something or I have this knowledge doesn't mean I should use it, especially if it's going to cause my brother who doesn't have the same set of knowledge to stumble. Why? Because knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. And so to answer the question very simply, does Paul say we can eat foods offered to idols? Absolutely, he does. But he says you shouldn't if it's going to cause your brother to stumble, right? Very simple explanation. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Look at verse number, I want to start down in verse number 18. He says in verse number 18, he says, look at Yashara'al after the flesh. Are not those who eat of the offerings sharers in the altar? Yes. What then do I say, that an idol is anything, or that which is offered to idols is anything? No. He's just repeating what he said in chapter number 8. Idols are nothing. He says, but what the Gentiles offer, they offer to demons and not to Elohim, and I do not want you to become sharers with demons. So he says in chapter number 8, you have the right to, but I don't necessarily want you to. And I believe, he's saying if you're going to give credence to this idol, if you're going to think it's something, then of course I don't want you to do that, right? But then in verse number 20, he says, 21, he says, you're not able to drink the cup of the Adon and the cup of demons. You are not able to partake of the table of the Adon and the table of demons. Do we provoke the Adon to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? Verse 23, all is permitted me, but not all do profit. All is permitted me, but not all build up. So here he says, all is permitted me. Obviously, I don't think Paul is saying that you can do whatever you want. We're sticking with the context here. He's talking about eating foods offered to idols. He says, all of this is permitted to me. So in chapter 8, he says, you have the right to eat foods offered to idols. In chapter 10, verse 23, he says, you have permission. I have permission to eat foods offered to idols. But he says, once again, in verse 24, let no one seek his own, but each one that of the other. You eat whatever is sold in the meat market, asking no questions because of conscience. For the earth belongs to Yhuh and all that fills it. And if any of the unbelievers invite you and you want to go, you eat whatever is put before you, asking no question on account of the conscience. So his whole thing is kind of like, don't ask, don't tell, right? In verse number 28, and if anyone says to you, this was offered to idols, do not eat it because of the one pointing it out to you and on account of the conscience, for the earth belongs to Yhuh and all that fills it. Now I say conscience, and this is what kind of took me back and said, He says, now I say conscience, not your own, but that of the other. For why is my freedom judged by another's conscience? He says, I say conscience, not your own. Back in verse 28, he says, you don't eat the food offered to idols, but you don't eat it because of the one pointing it out to you. He says, you don't eat it because of their conscience. And when I read that, I'm saying, why is he not saying you don't eat it because the Ra says you shouldn't eat it? Because the Most High says you shouldn't eat it. Well, that's not Paul's understanding. It doesn't go against Paul's conscience because Paul says he has the right to do it. Paul believes he has the permission to do it. So why would it grape against or grind against his conscience when he thinks it's okay to do it? So he says, I'm not talking about my own conscience. I'm not talking about your conscience. I'm talking about the person who's pointed out conscience, right? And he says, why is my freedom? So in chapter 8, he says, I have the right. In chapter 10, verse 23, he says, I have permission. And now in verse number 29, he says, I have the freedom. Verse 30, he says, but if I partake with thanks, I'm right here in verse number 30. But if I partake with thanks, why am I evil spoken of for what I give thanks? Let me stop and go to 1 Timothy 4, I believe is what it is. Paul says, why am I evil spoken of if I'm giving thanks for what I'm eating, right? This is what Paul's understanding was. He says here in verse number 2, speaking lies and hypocrisies, having been branded on their own conscience, forbidding to marry, to abstain from foods which Elohim created to be received with thanksgiving by those who believe and know. There goes that knowledge again, know the truth. I'm pretty sure he may be alluding to those same set of facts that he mentioned back in Corinthians. But he says in verse number 4, because every creature of Elohim is good and none is to be rejected if it is received with thanksgiving, for it is kadosh by the word of Yhuh and prayer. And so he here's speaking more about clean and unclean things. But again, the idea, he says he receives it with thanksgiving back in Corinthians, right? So as long as, it doesn't matter what this food is, if I'm praying over it and I'm giving thanks over it, then it's sanctified, right? It doesn't matter that it's been offered to an idol. That's Paul's understanding here. Continue on. Look at verse number 32. He says, cause no stumbling either to the Yahudim or to the Yamanites or to the assembly of Elohim. I've heard, when looking at this passage and those explaining, and they say, you got to look at Paul's audience, who he was talking to, right? Who he was talking about. He was talking to other nations, to Gentiles. Well, clearly Paul himself, as we're going to go through his, some more of his letters, he identifies himself as Yashara'al. He's writing to Gentiles or other nations. He's saying, I have the right, I have permission as a Yashara'al. I have the freedom to do it. So he's not just talking about Gentiles to Gentiles. He's saying everybody. That's why he says, cause no stumbling to Yahudim or Yamanites. That's other nations. This whole idea of you being able to eat foods offered to idols, that's for everybody. As long as you, give thanks over it, and as long as you pray over it, then you're good, right? But just because you can doesn't mean you should. And that's Paul's whole thing. In verse number 33, he says, as I also please all in all, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, that they might be saved. He says, I please all in all, right? So I'm just doing this because, I want to make sure that everybody can be saved. And so if it's good for you, it's good for me type of thing, right? But to answer the question very, very simply, does Paul teach that we can eat foods offered to idols? Yes or no? And I think the answer is very clearly yes. He says you have the right, we have permission, we have freedom. You just shouldn't if it's going to cause your brother to stumble. So the question I ask then as a follow-up is, does the Most High leave any room? To me, it seems that Paul creates a gray area that the Most High did not create. When you go back and read the Torah of Elohim, I don't see any gray areas where he says you can eat foods offered to idols if you have this certain set of knowledge. I don't see anywhere in the scriptures, in the Messianic writings, where the Most High has changed his stance and his mind on whether or not we can eat foods offered to idols. Matter of fact, let's go to Revelation, Yhuh, chapter number 1. And I'm going to start on verse number 1 because I think sometimes when we read the book of Revelation, we overlook this. But he says, the revelation of Yhuh HaMashiach, which Elohim gave him to show his servants what has to take place with speed. So understand that Yahushua did not come up with this revelation himself. His father gave this to him, and now he's giving it to his servants, right? And it says, and he, I believe this he here is being the father. Some interpret this being Yahushua, but either way, it's going to result in the same. He says, and he signified it by sending his messenger, which I believe to be Yahushua, to his servant Yhuh. So the father gives a revelation to Yahushua. Yahushua gives that as a messenger, gives that information or that revelation to Yhuh, right? So the point I'm making here is that these aren't words that originate with Yhuh. This revelation is not something that originated with Yahushua. This is the Father still speaking. He's just speaking through a messenger. So when we read Revelation, we understand these are still the words of the Father. And in chapter number 2, verse number 14, this is what the Father says by way of messenger. Here we have the assembly at Pergamum, and he gives them accommodation, but then he rebukes them. Now, understand that Revelation is coming after Paul writes. This is coming after Paul says we have the right, we have the permission, we have the freedom to eat foods offered to idols, right? This is the Father's stance on eating foods offered to idols. He says, but I hold a little against you because there are those who adhere to the teaching of Balaam. Remember, we talked about that, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Yashara'al, to eat offerings to idols and to commit whoring. It would seem to me that the Most High hasn't changed his mind about eating foods offered to idols. Paul says, if you eat it when there's a brother who doesn't have the knowledge, that's a stumbling block. The Most High says, no, eating it, period, is a stumbling block. It doesn't matter what set of knowledge you have. Eating it, period, is a stumbling block. But even more so, he says this was a teaching of Balaam that he taught to Balak. He said he put a stumbling block. Eating meats offered to idols, and that teaching literally puts a stumbling block. When you say it's okay to do it, it puts a stumbling block before the people of Yashara'al. And that was what was happening in this assembly at Pergamum, right? I think you get the point there. Let's go down to verse number 20, same chapter. Same thing. Here's an assembly at Thyatira. He gives them accommodations, but then here's the rebuke. He says, but I hold against you that you allow that woman Isabel or Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, to teach and lead my servants astray, to commit whoring, and to eat offerings to idols. So 2 times. We saw what the Most High said back in the Torah. We saw what was said in the Book of Wisdom. And here at the very end, we see that the Most High has not changed his mind when it comes to his stance on food offered to idols. He says it's a stumbling block, it's leading my servants astray, and those prophets who teach that are leading my servants astray. Remember, Balak was a prophet, but he still led the people astray by allowing them and teaching them that, eating foods offered to idols, right? Excuse me. So that's what the Most High stands is. He hasn't changed his mind. But one more, let's go to Acts chapter number 15. In Acts chapter number 15, this is that whole Jerusalem council. I'm not going to go through all of that. That's another video topic for another day. But at the end of that council, at the end of the determination there were some things that the emissaries and Jacob, who was the head of that, he told Paul, this is what you tell the Gentiles, okay? This is what you tell the other nations. And in verse number 29, he says this, that you abstain from what is offered to idols, in blood, and what is strangled, in whoring. If you keep yourselves from these, you shall do well, be strong. That's what Paul was told that he was to tell the other nations. However, in 1 Corinthians 8 and 10, we read Paul told them the exact opposite. He said, you can do it. And it seems to me, as we're going to go further in our studies, that Paul, somewhere along the line, kind of broke off and started doing his own thing. I don't want to get too ahead of myself, but it's very clear to me that, again, this was that smoking gun that took me back and said, all right, I got to take another look at Paul. Because, again, I know I keep using the word clear, but it is. When you remove that filter and those presuppositions, you can see that Paul said what he said very clearly. You can see what the Most High said, what he said very clearly. He said, don't do it. Paul said, you can. And doesn't matter what reason he gives that you can. The Most High didn't give us any reason that we could, but Paul says you can. And that in itself led me to take another look at Paul. And so hopefully this information here will pique your interest and say, all right, there's something to this. Let me not just dismiss this and draw any conclusion. We're going to go much, much more deeper into these teachings here in this presentation. So if you have not subscribed, please do so. Hit the notification bell. If you learned anything, got any insight, please give a thumbs up. That helps push this out to those who are seeking the same information. Share this video as well. Thank you so much for your attentiveness. And please, pray over this thing. Investigate what I've told you. Just don't take my word for it as well. Got so much more to go. And so until next time, learn the word, live the word, and share the word. Shalom.